Today on Locked On MLB, we honor the legacy of the great and underrated Roy White.
You are Locked On MLB, your daily MLB podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. I have been a baseball podcaster for over a decade now, and I'm now technically in the middle of my sixth season of the Locked On Podcast Network because we played 2 games. Follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and on Instagram. I am your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. And for those of you who want to post on any of those sites and you're listening to us all the time, please use that hashtag EverydaySully. It lets us know who's listening every single day. I am very, very excited to have our guest today. He is an author of many books about baseball, including one that I got, I think I got last summer. Either way, I remember reading it last summer, called Roy White, From Compton to the Bronx. And I'm very, very honored to bring aboard the good doctor, Dr. Paul Semendinger. How are you doing?
Sully, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Where are you physically on the map, Mr. Doctor?
I'm in New Jersey.
You are in there, and by your hat and by your background, I could tell you are a diehard New York Yankee fan. And I won't hold that against you because my mother grew up a diehard Yankee fan in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So there you go. But you co-wrote the book about Roy White. Now, Roy White is, for those of you who don't know, and it's kind of, in a way, it's sad that you don't know, but it's also, that's part of baseball, that teams that win a bunch and have a great legacy inevitably have superstars, Hall of Famers. But they also need to have players like Roy White, players who may not be the flashiest, may not have the biggest stats, however, provide a lot to the team, are basically the glue of the team. And if you're a fan of that era, you truly appreciate them. And Roy White was certainly that way for his many, many years with the New York Yankees.
Yes, just celebrated his 80th birthday in December. So, yeah, and we'll start off by saying one of, if not the nicest guy in the entire world. So, like, a lot of times you have a chance to meet your heroes and they have clay feet and you leave disappointed. I have never left an encounter of Roy White without being uplifted and feeling great, because he is just a genuinely nice person. In fact, I think we're probably going to get to it, but in Bill James's book, The Historical Baseball Abstract,
right,
he basically begins his thing about Roy White saying, Roy White is the nicest guy on the club. He is well respected by everybody, and he's very classy. He and his wife both. And that's a quote from Sparky Lyle in his book, The Bronx Zoo. So,
well,
all right,
you bring up the Bronx Zoo for a second. I think when you consider that was one of the most volatile clubhouses in the history of baseball, filled with some of the biggest egos and the biggest clashes with the media, the fact that nobody in the world has a bad thing to say about Roy White, whether they're a Billy guy, a Reggie guy, a Thurman guy, a George guy, a Sparky guy, the one unifying element is the fact everyone liked Roy White.
Yes. And we could get into some of that as well, like the influence he had on a player like Willie Randolph coming to the Yankees, and Willie seeing how classy Roy White was and saying, that's the guy I want to be like. And then Willie Randolph obviously becomes a Yankee captain, represents the team for, into the late 1980s. So for like 12 or 13 years, I think he was a Yankee, and is also considered one of the classiest guys in the history of the Yankee franchise.
Roy White, in so many ways, beyond just being a very classy guy, and he was a Yankee for a long time, not just because he was nice, but he was also a very, very good player. He was someone who connected several different eras of Yankeedom. When he came up with the Yankees, Roger Maris was still there. Whitey Ford was still there. It was 65, so it was no longer Yogi was no longer there. He had been fired the year before, but Roger Maris and
Mickey Mantle.
Mickey Mantle, Elston Howard. There was a lot of people that connected back to the Casey Stengel years, and by the time he left, he was in the second term of Billy Martin and the death of Munson in that 79 year. I mean, he connected that. And of course, later as a coach, coached Jeter and Bernie Williams and Rivera and Posada and Leyritz and all those people that we associate with the later teams. The through line is Roy White. He also was, in some ways, playing at the wrong time because, I mean, his stats and the way that he played, I think, would be appreciated more today as someone who focused on base. He led the league in walks in 1972. He had a very high on base percentage. You know, his strikeout totals were low. He had good speed, good power, good defense. He did all those things, and I think his life, he would have been loved by the sabermetric community a lot more than he was appreciated at the time that he played, where everything was focused on batting average, home runs, and runs batted in. There are a lot of times we look back at people who won the MVP. Why the hell did they win the MVP? Well, they led the league in RBIs. That was how people were judged back then. If Roy White played today, he would be an MVP candidate many, many times over.
No doubt. And the fact that we started the show by saying what a nice guy he was and what a positive influence in the clubhouse. And, you know, the more I've thought about that part of the game of Roy White, and of course, I think it was the 1970 or 71 season. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but he made no errors. He played left field, the first guy, I believe, in Yankee history to ever play left field and make no errors over an entire calendar baseball season. But when you have gigantic personalities, Reggie and Billy and Munson and Nettles and Sparky Lyle, to name just a few, working under an owner who's got a giant personality in George Steinbrenner. If all of those personalities continue to clash, that organization can't function. In order for the organization to function, you have to have some people there who bring a sense of calm and normalcy. And I have come to think about, if it weren't for Roy White, who was the leader on that team and the longest serving Yankee in that clubhouse, giving that sense of professionalism that players like Ron Guidry and Willie Randolph and Chris Chambliss, among others, followed, I don't think the Yankees win any of those World Series in the late 1970s.
He also was part of, I don't know if you're familiar with the book that a friend of the podcast, Dan Epstein, wrote along with Ron Bloomberg, called Thurman and Me.
Read it, yes.
Oh yeah,
Great
he's been a guest on our show several times, and that was an era of Yankeedom that when Roy White came of age, where he came up when the superstars were starting to break down, and then when a new class of Yankees started to emerge, they were not champions yet, because it was still Baltimore was still dominating what became the American League East, and they were not as good as Baltimore. You know, they were nowhere near as good as the Earl Weaver Orioles. But you started to see, kind of like a magic eye drawing, a group of players who were starting to gel. Munson obviously was the leader, but Ron Bloomberg was a huge fan favorite. And you had the emergence of Bobby Mercer, who was supposed to be the next Mickey Mantle, which was a little unfair because what he was Bobby Mercer, which was a very fine player. Roy White was a stable person there. Obviously, people refer to it as the Horace Clark years because he was kind of symbolized that team that was good, not great. But the Mets were the team of New York at the time. The Orioles were the team of the division. But the Yankee team was starting to brew, and Roy White was a big part of the turnaround of the Yankee franchise, beginning in those early years in the 1970s.
100%. One of the big shocks, of course, as you're talking about that era, was the fact that the Yankees traded away Bobby Mercer. Right. So he
Right.
was the next Mickey Mantle, as you say. And then in one of the big, ginormous trades, can you imagine trading Mickey Mantle for Willie Mays? The Yankees didn't do that, and the Giants didn't do that. But Bobby Bonds was the next Willie Mays out in San
Right.
Francisco, and Bobby Mercer was the next Mickey Mantle. And they were both ascending. They were both all-stars. They were both
Hmm.
prime players in their prime, and they were traded for one another. That was just before I became a fan. But sometimes I look back and I say, boy, I wish I was a fan at that point. What would I have been thinking? We got rid of Mercer, but we're getting Bobby Bonds. Unbelievable.
The season's about to start, and I just bought tickets to see the Red Sox play the Angels in Anaheim. And how did I buy my tickets? I got them through Game Time. Game Time is the fast and easiest way to buy tickets for all the baseball, hockey, basketball, music, comedy, theater events near you with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, view from the seats, and their best price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. They're obsessed with finding you ways to save money. The Game Time has deals right up to the start of event or even an hour after it starts in case you're going to a Dodger game. It's the place to find last-minute seats. Find exclusive flash deals and sponsored deals on tickets for football, basketball, hockey, baseball, concerts, comedy, and more. Zone deals, they got them. You pick the section, Game Time picks the seats, you get big savings. And with Game Time guarantee, which means you get the best price, if you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. What? Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets. The lowest prices. Do you know what they are? They're guaranteed. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? You have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories in sports without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. A lot of the things you wrote, I mean, it's a very apt title, From Compton to the Bronx, because
That
we
was
follow.
Roy's title. He wrote it.
Well, it's an apt title because we learn about his growing up in Los Angeles in the predominantly African American section of LA called Compton, and that, as I said before, he played along. Some of his teammates growing up wound up making it to the majors. Don Wilson and Reggie Smith, and there was another one who I can't think of off the top of my head that he had mentioned. But he wound up going to the minor leagues, signed by the Yankees. He didn't even know the Yankees were scouting him. He thought he was going to sign with the Angels, and then suddenly a Yankee scout came in. He thought, "Oh, I'm going to play in the World Series every year,"
That's
not
correct.
realizing that the Yankees were on the decline. But there's a couple fascinating stories. Unfortunately, the way baseball history seems to be written, and when we had Bob Kendrick from the Negro Leagues National Museum on the show, people seem to act like the minute Jackie showed up, all the strife ended for baseball players. In the 1960s, Roy White still had to face a lot of the bigotry and segregation of being a minor leaguer in the South. But can you relay the story about how he managed to get into the all-white hotel in the South there? That he
Yeah, so that's an unbelievable story. So Roy White, growing up in Compton, he'd heard of segregation, but he had never
Mhm,
lived it. Never was on an airplane until he was flying to his first spring training,
mhm.
and he gets to the facility. Now Roy's
In, this is in Florida, correct?
in Florida. Yep, Roy's
Right.
family was a mixed marriage.
Hmm.
So in from the 1940s, so like 80 years ahead of their time, right?
Right.
And so he's not typically dark African American. And so I guess whoever was assigning people to rooms assumed he was a white guy. And he would get to the training facility every
Did they
day.
just
And
look at his last name? Did he just look at his last name and think that was the case or
I have
something?
no idea. And we don't have an answer to that part of it. But
I
every
know.
day they'd get to the facility and he would practice with the team. And then there'd be lunch. And even among the team, like the players basically self-segregated. Like the black guys ate over here, the white guys ate over there, or whatever. And he would sit down and the guys would come to his table and they'd say, like, you're here every day, but where are you staying? We never see you. Because those African-American players weren't allowed to stay with the white guys in the team hotel. And Roy said, I forget which hotel it was called, but he said, I'm saying it, we'll just call it the Hilton. And they're like, you're not allowed to stay there. You're a black guy. And he goes, nobody knew.
Yeah.
And so that's where he stayed. But once spring training ended and he was assigned to a minor league team, for the years that he played minor league baseball all in the South, he faced segregation. He wasn't allowed to stay with his team. He wasn't allowed to eat in the same restaurants with his team. And I asked him a number of times, like, how did that make you feel? It must have been horrible. I can't imagine. And I think even today, 60 years later or so, I'd still be angry about the fact that people treated me differently just because I looked a little different.
Right.
And as an example of how classy Roy White is, he said, yeah, it wasn't great. And he, abuse and heckling from the fans during games and things like that. He said, but the guys who came before me had it tougher. And that's just what an amazing way to look at something, right? Instead of holding resentment, to instead hold the appreciation for the guys that came before him who had it tougher.
Well, I mean, that shows an inner strength and probably more of a strength than I may have had at the time. But yeah, then he persevered. He seemed to be very happy he didn't get assigned to, I think it was a minor league team in Idaho or something like that, that he was not looking forward to going to where it was like 20 degrees during game time. But by 1968, he was right around the time the Mets took over the city is when he emerged. I mean, his first full season, I mean, he played in 65, 66, and 67, and he was also in the Army Reserve, so he actually missed some playing time because of his time in the Army Reserve. I read the book. But
you did. Great job. Thank you.
But by the time in 1969, as the Mets took over the World Series, Roy White became an all-star. And Roy White was someone who had a very good batting average at a time when batting averages were lower than anything. He was stealing 20 some odd bases. He was a complete player for a Yankee team that was okay. Okay, but clearly overshadowed by the Mets.
Yeah, they weren't terrible. I think it was 1970, right? That the Yankees finished in second place. And it had been so many years, and there's the first time those guys even finished that high that they had like a champagne celebration in the locker room, and the New York reporters were saying, like, oh, how the mighty have fallen, that the great Yankees are celebrating second place. And some people were outraged by that, but you got to have some fun, right?
Right. Well, by the time, it's funny, the only time Roy White seemed to show any bitterness, and this is one of the most classy players we're ever going to have. Again, later became part of the coaching staff under Joe Torre, and I think he coached at other points of his career as well. But certainly I remember him. He and Chambliss and Randolph picked up a couple extra rings as coaching during those years, which I was living in New York at the time. Rough time to be a Red Sox fan in New York when they were piling up all those wins. But I digress. But the one time he seemed bitter, and you know which one I'm going to bring up. And I have read 3 or 4 for this other writing project that I'm doing, 3 or 4 biographies on Billy Martin, who is Dostoevsky would consider Billy Martin too complicated. He's a very complex man. And in the 1977 World Series, by the way, Roy White was a regular in 1977. He played 143 games that year. He was an everyday player, had a fine season, not one of his best, but still a solid, had power, stole a bunch of bases. And this is when they alternated years. One year they have the DH in the World Series for the whole series. Then the next year they had none. So there was no DH in the World Series. They had Reggie Jackson, Mickey Rivers, Lou Piniella, Roy White, and Paul Blair. They had 5 starting outfielders, and Billy Martin had to juggle that. And he basically told Roy White that he was going to platoon with Lou Piniella in the World Series against Los Angeles, against the team against LA, where he's from LA.
And with Reggie Smith on the other team, the guy he grew up with.
Reggie Smith on the other team, who, by the way, was the other Reggie who homered in Reggie Jackson's 3-home run game. But he knew they had at least one left-handed. They're going to do starts from a left-hander because they had Tommy John, and they know they had starts from right-handers with
Bert Hooton.
Don Sutton and Sutton, Bert Hooton, and I guess Charlie Huff was out.
Charlie Huff.
But anyway,
yep.
Charlie Huff. But they used him out of the pen. He was their knuckleball closer. I digress. I'm doing some of this from memory, but and he said, "I'll platoon you," and he played Piniella every day, and Roy White was reduced to pinch hitting in just a couple of games.
That is correct. And I think there's a lesson there. He didn't go to the World Series parade. Now, the next year he plays in the World Series a lot. Bob Lemon is the Yankee manager at the time, and he plays Roy White. He has a big home run in the World Series and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And he felt, you know what? I wasn't part of the celebration last year. I don't want to be a hypocrite and now be part of it just because I played more. But I think in retrospect, he looks back on those opportunities. How often do you get a chance to get in a parade down the Canyon of Heroes in New York City? And I think he wishes he had been part of those.
Hey, fans of daily fantasy sports, do I have a place for you? Prize Picks. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. This isn't you playing thousands of other players. You can pick more than or less than on a 2 to 6 player stat projection and watch the winnings roll in. This is the ideal time to make your picks in basketball, college, or the NBA. You want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like Meek Hill or Sugar Sean O'Malley? You can find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Now, I'm going to play this week, and I have De'Aaron Fox of the Sacramento Kings. He's going to get 20 points. And then, you know what? I think Kevin Durant is going to pull down 10 rebounds. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Once again, download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more. Pick less. It's that easy. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's available on Amazon Fire TV in the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV's channel app.
If you give me a second to get on a soapbox, Roy White, 15-year Yankee. I have the numbers in one of the appendixes. 7th all-time in games, 9th all-time in at-bats, 11th all-time. Think of all the great Yankees. 11th in WAR, 13th in runs, 11th in hits, 8th in walks, 2nd in sacrifice fly, 8th in times at-bats, 6th in stolen bases, 28th in home runs. People don't realize that he was a home run hitter. 20th in RBIs, 14th in total bases. Roy White, absolutely, positively, the only guy to play the entire decade of the 70s from the start to the finish. Thurman Munson would have been the other one, but obviously he tragically died. But the only guy to play the entire decade in the 70s, Roy White deserves to be in Monument Park in Yankee Stadium. He's better than a ton of the players who are already recognized there. And as you mentioned, you had Bob Kendrick on and the Negro League Museum. I mean, the story of Buck O'Neil is a tragic one. They have the special Hall of Fame election to let in Negro League players who belong in Cooperstown, and for whatever reason, he doesn't get in. So then they have to have a special election the next time, and he gets in. But in the meantime, he died. Yeah. And that's tragic, that someone spends their life representing a sport or a team, And for whatever reason, the team can't take the time to give them the due they deserve, at the end when they should be getting those recognitions. Roy White's 80. He's in great health. He's a great human being. But he's got to be in Monument Park, and that's got to happen. It will happen someday, but they need to do it while he's still here so that he can enjoy it and appreciate it. He deserves to run out on that field and have the fans cheer his name one last time in honor of the greatness that he brought to that team.
When you think about the Yankee Legends, I'm not one who worships at the altar of war, but I understand that it's a good sort of thumbnail of evaluating a career. Only 10 Yankees have a higher WAR for position player than him. Here are the names of the 10 Yankees who have a higher WAR by position player. Bernie Williams, who I think is the most underrated player of that 90s squad.
And he's in Monument Park.
Yes. Alex Rodriguez.
Not yet.
Not yet, should be. Willie Randolph, who's another person who should be in. Oh, he's in Monument Park.
He's there.
Okay, yeah. Bill Dickey, whose number is retired. Yogi Berra, number retired. Derek Jeter. I'm not familiar
He's out
with
there.
him. I'm not familiar with that name. Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, Lou Gehrig, Babe Ruth.
Okay, and 4 of those guys you just named all played after Roy White. So when he retired, what's that? 10-9, he was 7th. The 7th grade. They didn't have WAR back then, but by WAR, at his retirement, he would have been the 7th greatest Yankee player by WAR. How that doesn't make you elite enough to go into Monument Park, I have no clue.
Neither do I. But I do have a clue of why you're on this show, Dr. Paul Semendinger. Let's bring out our trivia question. You know this, but Roy White played his entire major league career with the New York Yankees. But after he retired from the Yankees, he played somewhere else. If you know, that's a trivia question. I know you know. Where did Roy White play after his Yankee career ended? Put the answer down in YouTube or wherever you want to. That's the trivia question for today. Paul Semendinger, Dr. Paul Semendinger, could you please tell us where we can follow you and buy some of your other books?
Oh, you're awesome. So I obviously you have my Twitter feed on there. Here's my book commercial. We have the Roy White book. I just published this book, which is a motivational book where I ran every day for a calendar year.
Oh, wow.
Here's the other Yankee book we talked about, The Least Among Them. Here's the wonderful novel, Scattering the Ashes. So you can find me. I am the editor-in-chief of the Start Spreading the News Yankee site, which, by the way, is the classiest and nicest and best Yankee site out there. We've been doing it every single day, at least 3 articles every single day since 2017. I also have another site, Dr. Paul Sem, DrPaulSem.com. And so you can find me there, but the books you'll find everywhere. You could find them at apbooks.net. That's the publisher site for each of those books, or they're all on Amazon. Just type in Semendinger. It's sometimes hard to spell, but they're all out there. And if you love them, please leave them a nice positive review. Authors love and appreciate positive reviews.
And follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and on Instagram. I am your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram, giving Roy White his due with a good doctor, Dr. Paul Semendinger, somewhere in northern New Jersey. My name is Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.